December 7, 1941. The morning that changed the world. Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor like steel hawks. In less than 2 hours, America's Pacific Fleet was crippled, battleships burned in the harbor, and the sky was filled with black smoke and disbelief. But amid the chaos, one thing stood out to the few pilots who survived the onslaught: the speed and grace of the enemy fighters. Those aircraft, agile, relentless, and impossibly maneuverable, were the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. They seemed untouchable. American pilots described them as turning on a dime, climbing like a homesick angel. In the first 6 months of the war, Japan ruled the skies of the Pacific. From the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, from Rabaul to Wake Island, the Zero dominated every battlefield it touched. U.S. pilots flying the F4F Wildcats, P-40 Warhawks, and P-39 Airacobras quickly realized they were outmatched. Dogfights became nightmares. Many pilots never even saw the Zero that killed them. The aircraft's design was revolutionary for its time, built from lightweight alloys, stripped of unnecessary armor, and equipped with long-range fuel tanks that gave it unmatched reach. While American planes relied on toughness and firepower, the Zero embodied speed and finesse. Its pilots could dive, roll, and twist out of nearly any situation. Japan's Naval Air Service had created a weapon perfectly suited for the early war: fast, light, and deadly in the hands of elite aviators. By early 1942, morale in U.S. air units was dangerously low. Commanders scrambled to understand how Japan's airmen were achieving such dominance. Every combat report repeated the same haunting question: what makes the Zero invincible? But intelligence was scarce. Wrecks recovered from Pacific battles were shattered beyond recognition, burnt, corroded, or sunk beneath the waves. No one had ever seen a fully intact Zero. In Washington, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics was desperate for answers. American engineers at Grumman and Chance Vought studied combat footage, pilot testimonies, and fragments of downed aircraft, trying to deduce the Zero's secrets. But without a complete specimen, it was like trying to rebuild a ghost. Every new fighter design, including Grumman's developing F6F Hellcat, was built on speculation, not certainty. They needed hard data. They needed to know exactly how the Zero performed, its turning radius, stall speeds, climb rate, and weaknesses, and then fate intervened. In June 1942, as Japanese forces launched a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands, meant to distract from their main assault on Midway, one pilot made a critical mistake. Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, a skilled Zero pilot from the aircraft carrier Ryujo, took off on a mission to attack Dutch Harbor, Alaska. His plane was hit by ground fire. A single bullet pierced his oil line. Losing power, Koga tried to make an emergency landing on the nearby island of Akutan. The terrain, however, was treacherous, soft, wet tundra that appeared flat from the air. As his wheels touched down, the landing gear dug in and the aircraft flipped onto its back. Koga died instantly. His wingman, fearing capture, circled once and then departed, leaving the wreck behind. For weeks, the downed Zero lay untouched, half buried in the mud, its pilot still inside. When American forces finally discovered it, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Unlike any previous crash site, this aircraft was almost completely intact. The soldiers secured the area, recovered the body of Koga, and carefully salvaged the aircraft. The discovery was immediately reported to higher command. When word reached U.S. naval intelligence, it was met with disbelief. They had captured a complete Mitsubishi A6M Zero, serial number 4593. The plane was shipped to the naval base at Dutch Harbor, then to North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego. Mechanics and engineers worked tirelessly to restore it to flying condition, meticulously repairing its landing gear, reassembling its control systems, and replacing shattered panels. When the restoration was complete, one man was chosen to fly it, a calm, analytical test pilot named Lieutenant Eddie Sanders. He understood the gravity of his task. He wasn't just flying an enemy aircraft. He was flying the key to turning the tide of an entire war. Sanders climbed into the cockpit, took a deep breath, and pushed the throttle forward. For the first time in history, an American pilot flew the aircraft that had haunted their skies. And what he learned would reshape the Pacific Air War forever. The engine roared to life, its hum distinct, smoother, lighter, almost delicate compared to the heavier American designs. Lieutenant Eddie Sanders guided the aircraft down the runway at North Island Naval Air Station. Every man on the ground held his breath. This was no ordinary test flight. This was the enemy's greatest weapon, alive under American hands. As the captured Zero lifted off the ground, Sanders instantly felt the difference. It was astonishingly light on the controls. The aircraft responded with the reflexes of a living creature, almost anticipating his every movement. It climbed like nothing he had flown before, slicing through the California air with predatory grace. But beneath that elegance, Sanders began noticing flaws, subtle, dangerous ones. At high speeds, the controls stiffened dramatically. In steep dives, it shuddered and lost stability. And the lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks meant it was fast. Yes, but fatally fragile. For weeks, he conducted test after test, measuring roll rates, stall speeds, climb performance, and turn radii. Every maneuver was documented in detail. He compared the Zero's handling to the F4F Wildcat, the current U.S. Navy fighter, and found that while the Zero could easily outturn and outclimb it, it could not match its ruggedness or high-speed performance. The Navy's engineers now had the data they'd been praying for. The myth of the Zero, the legend that had terrified Allied pilots, began to unravel under cold mechanical truth. The tests revealed the Zero's genius, but also its limitations. Its extraordinary range came from extreme weight-saving measures. No armor plating, no bulletproof glass, and fuel tanks that would ignite at the first hit. Its lightweight structure gave it unparalleled agility, but also meant it couldn't dive as fast or survive. Hits the way heavier American fighters could. What had once seemed invincible was now understood as a machine with strengths and weaknesses. The discovery sent ripples through the Navy and the aircraft industry. At Grumman Aircraft Engineering, engineers had already been working on a new design, the F6F Hellcat. Originally, it was meant to be a modest evolution of the F4F Wildcat, but after the Zero's tests were analyzed, the project changed direction completely. Grumman's founder, Leroy Grumman, often called Iron Works for his hands-on approach, personally reviewed the data from the captured Zero. He knew immediately that their new aircraft needed to exploit every flaw the Japanese fighter had. The Hellcat's airframe was redesigned to prioritize strength over lightness. Its wings were larger, its engine more powerful, and its dive stability unmatched. It would not try to outturn the Zero. It would outclimb it, outdive it, and outlast it. As one engineer at Grumman put it, "We didn't need to build a Zero. We needed to build something that could kill one." By late 1942, the first Hellcat prototypes took flight. They were heavier, sturdier, and packed with a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, a brute compared to the Zero's lightweight Nakajima power plant. At the same time, U.S. Navy training doctrine evolved. Based on Sanders' findings, American pilots were retrained to fight smarter, to never engage the Zero in turning battles, but to use boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude, firing, and pulling away before the Zero could respond. This intelligence didn't just inform design. It reshaped the entire mindset of aerial warfare. In the Pacific, instructors circulated a now famous document titled Tactics Against the Japanese Zero. It contained detailed guidance derived directly from Sanders' tests, how to evade, how to strike, how to exploit the Zero's weaknesses. Pilots memorized it like scripture. By the end of 1942, the tide had begun to shift. The Allies now understood the enemy they faced. And deep inside Grumman's Long Island factory, the first production F6F Hellcats were rolling off the assembly line, the physical embodiment of everything the Akutan Zero had revealed. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike any other, where knowledge, design, and courage would collide in the open skies of the Pacific. The Hellcat was ready to fly. And soon it would meet its teacher, in combat. Lieutenant Eddie Sanders wasn't a combat ace. He was a test pilot, methodical, analytical, patient, the kind of man who trusted numbers more than instinct, yet his contribution would save countless lives in combat. For 6 weeks he flew the captured Zero, 26 separate test flights, pushing it to its limits. Every climb, every dive, every snap roll was recorded and dissected. His notes read more like those of a scientist than a soldier, precise, clinical, emotionless. But behind the calm was a deep sense of purpose. Each time Sanders climbed into the cockpit, he knew that one mistake could destroy both the aircraft and the priceless data it represented. The Zero had no safety modifications, no dual controls, no parachute ejection system. It was an enemy machine, and one wrong move meant death. Still, he flew it again and again. The engineers at North Island gathered around after every landing, notebooks in hand, eager for his observations. He told them the truth. It was magnificent at low speeds but clumsy when pushed too hard. Deadly in a turning fight but slow to roll. Fast to climb but fragile under fire. His bravery wasn't in battle. It was in exploration. He risked his life not to destroy the Zero but to understand it. And in doing so, he gave America the keys to victory in the skies. When Sanders' reports were forwarded to Navy Command, they became essential reading material for designers and tacticians. His findings were not only technical data, they were insight into the enemy's soul. To understand why the Zero dominated early in the war, one must see it through the eyes of its creators. In 1937, Japan's Navy sought an aircraft with impossible requirements. A fighter that could outturn, outclimb, and outrange every opponent, while still operating from aircraft carriers. Engineer Jiro Horikoshi accepted that challenge. The result was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering, a design that rewrote the rulebook of aerial combat. The Zero's airframe was crafted from a rare aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin, giving it both strength and feather-like weight. It could travel over 2,500 miles without refueling, more than double most Allied fighters. And its 20mm cannons and twin machine guns made it devastating in close combat. But Horikoshi's brilliance came at a price. To achieve such agility and range, his team stripped away everything non-essential: armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, even cockpit protection. The Zero was built not to survive, but to never be hit. That philosophy worked perfectly until American pilots learned its limits. Once Sanders' team revealed the Zero's structural weaknesses, U.S. designers saw an opportunity. The Hellcat would be everything the Zero wasn't: durable, heavily armored, and forgiving. Its pilots could take hits and live. The Zero's pilots could not. The Akutan Zero, in that sense, was both a marvel and a warning. It embodied the peak of Japanese aviation philosophy and exposed its fatal vulnerability. Before 1942, American pilots faced a terrifying dilemma. Engage a Zero in a turning fight and you'd die. Try to outclimb it and you'd fail. Run, and it would catch you. The first months of the Pacific War were filled with losses and confusion. Pilots described the Zero's maneuvers as impossible. But once Sanders's tests reached the fleet, everything changed. U.S. instructors revised dogfighting doctrine entirely. They taught new pilots to never turn with a Zero. Instead, climb high, dive fast, strike once, and escape before the Zero could react. It became known as the boom and zoom tactic. The Zero's greatest strength, its lightness, became its undoing. It couldn't follow a fast-diving Hellcat without losing control. Its controls stiffened at high speed, and its thin wings risked structural failure. Suddenly, the Zero wasn't a ghost anymore. It was a target with predictable weaknesses. This shift in tactics transformed the morale of American pilots. For the first time, they didn't fear the Zero. They understood it. And in air combat, understanding was everything. Every engagement now carried the confidence of knowledge. The myth of invincibility had been broken by data, courage, and engineering. And as America's new fighter rolled off production lines, the lessons from that captured Zero would soon be tested in battle, against the very machines it had once flown beside. In early 1942, while battles raged across the Pacific, the offices of Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, Long Island, were alive with urgency. The company's founder, Leroy Roy Grumman, was a pragmatic engineer, not a man for grand speeches, but one who believed in building machines that brought pilots home alive. When reports from Eddie Sanders' test flights arrived, Grumman and his lead designers, William Schwendler and Robert Hall, gathered around the data sheets in silence. Every figure told a story. The Zero's unmatched agility, its fragile frame, its slow dive recovery. Grumman realized the path forward instantly. They would not copy Japan's design. They would counter it. Grumman's philosophy was simple. Give the pilot the advantage, not just the airplane. The team scrapped their early F6F prototypes and began rebuilding the aircraft from the ground up. The engine was replaced with a monstrous Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial, delivering over 2,000 horsepower. The wings were widened for lift and strength. The cockpit was armored, the fuel tank self-sealing, and the landing gear built to absorb the punishment of carrier operations. Grumman famously carved wooden models by hand to visualize mechanical solutions. The man was both an engineer and a craftsman. When the prototype Hellcat took to the sky in mid-1942, it was unlike anything the Navy had flown before. It wasn't elegant. It was a tank with wings. And it would soon become the most successful carrier-based fighter of the war. Grumman's team had achieved something extraordinary. They had turned the enemy's strengths into their blueprint for dominance. While American engineers were rethinking everything, Japan remained largely unmoved by the warnings of its own pilots. Reports from frontline aviators, men who had faced tougher, faster American planes, were often dismissed by high command. The Zero's creator, Jiro Horikoshi, understood that time was running out. He proposed several upgrades: better engines, improved armor, self-sealing fuel tanks. But Japan's industrial system was already strained by war. Aluminum shortages, limited engine power plants, and bureaucratic rigidity strangled innovation. Worse still, Japan's leadership clung to the belief that superior skill could overcome technological inferiority. Their best pilots, veterans from China and early Pacific campaigns, continued to rely on dogfighting tactics that favored agility over protection. It was a fatal mistake. As U.S. fighters like the Hellcat and Corsair began entering service, the Zero's advantage evaporated. In 1943, at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Japanese pilots were shot down in droves. They could still turn tighter, but now it no longer mattered. The Zero had become a relic of a vanished doctrine. Its glory days were over, even if Japan refused to see it. The Akutan Zero, captured by fate, had revealed every weakness that Tokyo denied. And in doing so, it silently betrayed the empire that built it. War is not only fought with machines, it's fought with beliefs. In 1941 and early 1942, the Zero was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of invincibility. Pilots spoke of it with awe and fear. Every encounter was a test of survival, not victory. That fear rippled across squadrons and affected morale at every level of command. But when the data from Sanders' flights spread through naval training commands, something profound changed. Knowledge replaced fear. Pilots were now told, it's just another airplane, and it can be beaten. Flight instructors showed them the diagrams, where the Zero's controls stiffened, how it lost energy in dives where its unprotected tanks sat. Simulators and briefings emphasized one mantra: don't turn with a Zero. Confidence returned. By the time the Hellcat entered mass production, young aviators joining the Pacific Fleet no longer feared the red circle on the wings of their opponent. They respected it, but they knew how to destroy it. That psychological transformation cannot be overstated. It turned a reactive air force into an aggressive, dominant one. And when confidence returned to the cockpit, the Pacific War began to tilt decisively westward. The skies were no longer Japan's. They were becoming America's domain. And that shift from fear to mastery would soon be proven in the largest carrier battles the world had ever seen. By the summer of 1943, the Pacific had changed. The Allies were no longer fighting to survive. They were beginning to advance. And leading that charge was a new machine, born directly from the wreckage of the Akutan Zero, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. It was a brute of a fighter, wide-winged, heavily armed, and intimidating even while idling on a carrier deck. Pilots joked that it looked like it could eat Zeros for breakfast, and soon it did. The Hellcat first saw combat in August 1943 over Marcus Island. From the very first engagement, its superiority was clear. American pilots could dive faster, hit harder, and, for the first time, come home alive. The lessons learned from Sanders' captured Zero were now alive in the skies. The Hellcat's pilots flew with precision, using new tactics tailored to exploit the Japanese fighters' flaws. They avoided turning duels. Instead, they climbed high, dove at blistering speed, fired short, deadly bursts, and then climbed away again before the Zero could respond. At high altitudes and in steep dives, the Hellcat remained rock solid, while the Zero struggled, its controls locking up under the stress of speed. In a single second of engagement, the outcome was often decided. By the time of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaign in late 1943, the Hellcat had become the dominant fighter in the Pacific. Its 2,000 horsepower engine made it climb like a rocket, and its .650 caliber Browning machine guns shredded anything within range. Japanese pilots, once masters of the sky, found themselves outmatched in every way. Their tactics, relying on tight turns and head-on charges, were suicide against the Hellcat's armor and firepower. The transformation was so rapid, so complete, that even veterans of earlier campaigns could hardly believe it. In 1942, American pilots had prayed just to survive a single encounter. By 1944, they hunted Zeros in groups, confident and methodical. The captured Akutan Zero had revealed every flaw that U.S. engineers needed to exploit. And now, those revelations were being written in fire across the Pacific sky. The defining moment came 2 years after the discovery of Koga Zero. It was called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The U.S. Navy's task force sailed near the Marianas Islands, a massive formation of carriers, cruisers, and destroyers supporting the invasion of Saipan. On the morning of June 19th, Japanese Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched over 300 aircraft, Zeros, dive bombers, and torpedo planes in a desperate attempt to crush the American fleet. Waiting for them were the Hellcats. Radar picked up the incoming waves long before they reached the fleet. Squadrons scrambled from carriers like the USS Essex, Yorktown, and Enterprise. Within minutes, the sky above the Pacific filled with the roar of engines. The greatest carrier air battle in history was beginning. The first wave of Japanese aircraft never stood a chance. Hellcats intercepted them 70 miles out, diving from altitude with devastating accuracy. The Japanese formations disintegrated. Pilots reported scenes of chaos, Zeros burning, tumbling into the sea, unable to break away from the assaults. Commander David McCampbell, flying from the Essex, described the air battle as a slaughter. He personally downed 9 enemy planes in a single day, a feat unmatched in naval history. By nightfall, over 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The U.S. lost barely 24, a 19:1 kill ratio, unprecedented, unthinkable, and it all traced back to the lessons learned from that single captured aircraft on a frozen Alaskan island. The Hellcat had become not just a weapon, but a symbol of industrial power, intelligence, and adaptation. It was the physical manifestation of everything the United States had learned from its early defeats. The once mystical Zero was now prey, not predator. And the skies over the Pacific, once ruled by Japan's red suns, now belonged to the blue insignia of the United States Navy. But the story didn't end there. For the men who flew these machines, every battle carried memories of those who never made it home. Every victory in a Hellcat was also a tribute to those who'd fallen to the Zero before the tide had turned. And as the Pacific campaign intensified, through the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the Hellcat's reign of dominance would only grow stronger. The ghost of the Akutan Zero still lingered, but now, it was a lesson written in steel and courage. By late 1944, the Hellcat had rewritten the air war over the Pacific. From the Aleutians to the Marianas, from Tarawa to the Philippine Sea, it was everywhere. And behind every sortie, every mission, was a quiet truth that few ever spoke aloud. They owed much of their dominance to one dead Japanese pilot, Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga. He had died alone, far from home, in a lonely Alaskan bog. But his Zero, preserved almost perfectly by the cold, had done what no intelligence report or captured blueprint ever could. It opened the door to understanding Japan's most lethal weapon. That understanding didn't just change tactics. It changed doctrine, design, and destiny. In 1942, the Zero was the embodiment of Japan's aerial supremacy, fast, agile, and seemingly untouchable. American pilots learned the hard way that traditional dogfighting meant death. But once the U.S. analyzed the Akutan Zero, everything shifted. Engineers at Grumman and Vought took the findings and used them to redesign future fighters. The F6F Hellcat and the F4U Corsair both drew heavily from those lessons. The engineers noted that the Zero sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks for agility, a deadly trade-off once American firepower increased. They realized that a faster, sturdier aircraft, one that could dive at higher speeds and absorb punishment, could dominate the skies through brute force and superior tactics. That's exactly what the Hellcat became. The U.S. Navy even began training its pilots to fight using energy tactics. Instead of turning with the Zero, they climbed, dove, and attacked from above, maintaining altitude and speed advantages that the lighter Japanese planes couldn't match. By 1944, the entire philosophy of aerial warfare in the Pacific had evolved. American pilots were no longer reactive. They were calculating, disciplined, and relentless. They didn't duel for pride. They hunted for survival. October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history. The Japanese fleet, desperate and fractured, launched one last major counterattack. Hundreds of aircraft, including what few Zeros remained, hurled themselves against the American invasion forces. Hellcats met them head-on. Wave after wave of Japanese pilots, many barely trained, were cut down. The sky over Leyte turned into a storm of tracer fire and smoke. By the end of the battle, the once mighty Japanese Navy Air Service was effectively destroyed, but the horror was not over. In 1945, during the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, a new terror emerged, the kamikaze. Young men, many barely 20 years old, flew Zeros loaded with bombs directly into American ships. It was the Zero's final evolution, no longer a weapon of dominance but of desperation. Hellcat pilots were forced to intercept suicide planes before they could reach the fleet. For many, it was the hardest fighting of the entire war. They watched as the same machine that once symbolized Japan's technological superiority became a coffin for its own sons. The Akutan Zero had once revealed Japan's strength. Now it revealed Japan's tragedy. By the end of World War II, the numbers spoke for themselves. The Grumman Hellcat achieved an astonishing 19.1 kill ratio, 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat for only 270 losses. No other fighter in history achieved that scale of dominance, and it all traced back to one aircraft, a single frozen Zero, recovered in June 1942 from an Alaskan bog. That discovery reshaped the course of the Pacific War. It armed engineers with priceless data, gave pilots the tools to survive, and turned the tide of the air war in just 2 short years. Even decades later, historians and pilots alike point to the Akutan Zero as one of the most valuable intelligence finds of the entire conflict. Without it, the Pacific War could have dragged on longer, costing countless more lives. The Hellcat's shadow extended even beyond the war. Its success inspired post-war designs like the F6F Bearcat, and its combat philosophy, emphasizing speed, altitude, and energy, laid the groundwork for the jet age. After the war, the Akutan Zero was taken on a tour across the United States. Engineers, students, and officers studied it closely, a silent teacher of what had been and what could never be again. But time was cruel. In 1945, during a routine training flight, the aircraft crashed and was destroyed. The last original Akutan Zero was lost, but its legacy lived on in every pilot who took to the sky afterward. Today, fragments of that plane are preserved in museums. Small pieces of aluminum, twisted and corroded by time, displayed behind glass. For most visitors, they are just relics, silent reminders of a bygone war. But for those who know the story, they represent something far greater. A moment in history when fate, accident, and human curiosity collided. When the fall of one pilot gave rise to victory for another, and when the balance of the Pacific War turned, not on the deck of a carrier, or in the flash of a bomb, but in the quiet of an Alaskan marsh, where a single Zero came to rest. The war would end less than a year later. The Empire of Japan would fall, and the world would enter an age of jets, missiles, and atomic power. But the lessons of that plane, of understanding your enemy, of learning even from defeat, would remain eternal. Because in war, knowledge is as deadly as any bullet. And the Akutan Zero proved that sometimes, one lost aircraft can change the fate of nations. The war had ended. The skies over the Pacific were finally quiet. The thunder of engines, the flash of tracers, the screaming dives, all gone. Yet deep in the archives of the U.S. Navy and the memory of its pilots, the story of the Akutan Zero remained. A story that began not in glory but in accident. A plane that fell in the wrong place, at the right time. When engineers at Grumman first disassembled the captured Zero in 1942, they were astonished by what they found. Not just clever engineering, but a philosophy. The Japanese had built the A6M for total dominance at the start of the war. Lightweight, nimble, and designed for the offensive. But it was a weapon of a moment, not a weapon of endurance. The Zero had no armor for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no forgiveness. It demanded perfection, both from its pilots and its nation, and perfection in war never lasts. What the Americans learned wasn't just about mechanics, it was about balance. Every advantage comes with a cost. Every strength hides a weakness. The Akutan Zero showed them both. That lesson changed how the Allies built everything afterward, from tanks and ships to the jet fighters of the Cold War. Survivability became as important as speed, endurance as vital as agility. The Hellcat was proof of that evolution, a plane built to outlast as much as to outfight. For Lieutenant Eddie Sanders, the test pilot who first flew the captured Zero, the experience left a lasting impression. He spoke later about the sensation of flying it, smooth, precise, almost effortless. But he also noted its fragility. He understood in that cockpit that Japanese pilots weren't magicians. They were human, fighting with a machine that demanded their life in exchange for its power. That human understanding, that empathy, even for the enemy, became a silent part of how the next generation of aviators were trained. They studied not only how to defeat their enemies, but how to think like them. Because in the end, knowledge, not hatred, wins wars. Today, the physical plane is gone. The last of its aluminum burned and buried in time. But its image endures. In photographs, in blueprints, in every Hellcat that once thundered across the Pacific. A few fragments of its skin are still preserved. In museums, dull gray metal etched by salt and history. They sit behind glass, quiet and unassuming. But if you stand close enough, you can almost hear the echo of what they meant. For Japan, it was the symbol of early triumph. For America, it became the key to redemption. For history, it was proof that a single accident can shift the balance of a global war. It's easy to see war as a contest of steel and fire, of technology, strategy, and numbers. But the Akutan Zero reminds us that wars are fought just as much by observation, adaptation, and human ingenuity. The Zero itself was a marvel of design, but it became obsolete not because it was poorly made, but because its creators stopped evolving. The United States, through the Hellcat, embodied the opposite: constant adaptation, relentless learning, and humility in the face of defeat. Every rivet of the F6F carried the echoes of lessons learned the hard way. Every pilot who climbed into one did so with the confidence that their machine was born not just from victory, but from understanding. That mindset, to learn even from your enemy, became one of America's most enduring strengths in the decades that followed. If you could stand today on Akutan Island, the wind would still sound the same. Lonely, cold, and endless. Somewhere, beneath the moss and tundra, pieces of that Zero might still rest buried in silence. The sky above is peaceful now. But 80 years ago it was a theater of death and courage. The ghosts of pilots, Japanese and American alike, once crossed these skies, bound by duty, belief, and the same fragile machines. Each believed his cause was just. Each flew toward destiny. And in the wreckage of one of those planes, the course of the entire Pacific War changed forever. The Akutan Zero teaches a timeless truth, that even in the darkest chapters of war, knowledge and understanding can emerge as forces for good. One plane fell, and from its fall thousands of others rose. It turned fear into mastery, loss into strategy, defeat into progress. And though time has carried its wreckage into obscurity, its legacy still flies. In every lesson learned, in every innovation born from necessity, and in every soul who seeks to understand rather than just to destroy. Because sometimes history turns not on the might of empires, but on the quiet discovery of a single fallen machine.